I'm going to start with an objective reality, and it's that paying with a tap and go card feels 15% cheaper than using a chip and pin. And chocolate tastes sweeter when in circles than in squares. Painkillers are more effective when you tell people they're more expensive. And wine tastes better when poured from a heavier bottle. Now, a lot of these facts, if you will, may seem completely ambiguous and untrue. But the reality is that this is some of the behavioural science research that is done by the gentleman who is joining me today called Rory Sutherland. He's the Vice Chairman of Ogilvy in the UK, and he works with a group of psychology graduates who look for these unforeseen opportunities in consumer behaviour and create new marketing behaviour altogether, inventing new markets or strategies that didn't exist in the past. In addition, on this podcast, and this is something I haven't done before, so bear with us, I'm joined by a previous podcast guest of ours called Ian Whitworth from Scene Change, who I'm sure a few of you are familiar with. Rory, Ian, thanks so much for being with me today.
It's a great pleasure.
Rory, introduce us to this, right? I've just dropped that objective reality, which is a world that I think is very familiar to you, but not as familiar to everyone else. Can you talk us through this way that you approach the world?
Well, I think in a way, marketing, by getting obsessed with lots and lots of functions of marketing, and also by being disproportionately, I think, obsessed with communication. I think the whole concept of marcoms is a disaster, because if the marketing function of a business becomes seen as the comms function, it doesn't get seen as a fundamental strategic necessity that must be present at board level for its view. It just becomes reprographics with a degree. It just becomes a kind of support function, and it's seen as a cost, not a source of value. And I think marketing repeatedly misses the really big story in marketing, which is that human epistemology and perception is very, very strange. Let's just say very, very strange. Okay, so I think the bedrock for behavioral science has to be evolutionary psychology, because that's the one big explanatory thing for all this weirdness. And the point is very simply that there's a great book, by the way, just come out by an American author called The Case Against Reality. And his argument is, if you look at how human perception has evolved, if there has to be a trade-off between evolutionary fitness and objective accuracy, fitness is going to win every time. You know, it's why we see faces in clouds or rock formations, because it's disproportionately valuable to us in survival terms, and in some cases reproductive terms, by the way, to be disproportionately inclined to spot faces. Because anything with two dots and another dot might be something we can eat. It might be something that's going to attack us. It might be something that will mate with us. And being able to read facial expression, i.e., is this person going to mate with me or kill me, okay, is absolutely vastly more important to your survival than being able to name the Pantone reference of a particular color. Indeed, in survival, noticing contrast is much more important than being able to judge absolute values.
Pantone colors change every year, don't they?
They do anyway, yeah.
Is constant.
And so once you accept this, and actually in the book, The Case Against Reality, he takes a very extreme view. He says that human consciousness and perception bears the same relation to what's really going on as a computer desktop does to what's going on within the computer. It's essentially an interface that makes decisions for us manageable and easy and quick to make. And it presents us not with the information that is there, it presents us with the information that's actually important to survival. And what that means fundamentally is that when we make the mistake in attempting to look objective and scientific, that we design things for their objective qualities, not their perceptual qualities. And the example I always give in the book, and by the way, I think that a very large number of billion-dollar businesses have been created, or have rather formed, because either intentionally or just as likely by accident, they've stumbled on something which is perceptually very powerful, which an objective person would say was relatively unimportant. So let's say you're designing a new taxi firm. one of the questions you'd ask and one of the metrics you'd use is how long on average does it take someone to wait for a cab? Okay. Now, Uber completely solved that problem by having a map on the app. Now, the truth of the matter is what humans care about, what makes them either relaxed or upset and anxious, isn't actually the duration of the wait, it's the degree of certainty. And basically, once you can watch the car approaching on your map, your anxiety levels plummet. It completely changes the emotional experience of booking a cab. Because put bluntly, people would rather wait 12 minutes for a car knowing where it is than wait 7 minutes for a car or 9 minutes for a car in a state of uncertainty. So there's a wonderful finding which sort of mirrors this. I'll give you two further examples. The single best thing the London Underground did to improve passenger satisfaction wasn't anything objective. It didn't make the trains faster, more frequent, more comfortable, anything of that kind. It didn't make the trains larger, more capacious. Dot matrix displays on the platform were the most important thing. Because again, people would rather wait 13 minutes for a train knowing there's a train coming in 13 minutes than wait 5 minutes while going, is there a train at all? And so we can take that a little bit further. One bit of advice to an airline, which applies to any airline, is we said there's an enormous difference between BA Flight 269 delayed and BA Flight 269 delayed 80 minutes. The delayed 80 minutes we experience as a minor annoyance most of the time. The single word delayed, you might as well just replace it with be miserable. Because you've given us bad information, but without a worst case scenario. And that's exactly what humans have evolved to really, really hate. The lack of certainty, if you like, is something that really, really upsets us. And the reason this is so important is because most of the time, the data that's available in abundance is objective data. And what that data concerns is what something is, not how it makes people feel. And people make decisions and act. Their actions are driven by feelings, not by what's objectively true. Now, the reason the book's called Alchemy, very simply, is there are butterfly effects where the same thing objectively, like chocolate taste, the perception of it, and therefore our reaction to it and the behavior it engenders, can be completely transformed by not changing the thing objectively at all, but, for example, by telling a different story about it or by comparing it to something else. And sorry to burble on, it's time for you to speak, but I'll tell the simplest example of how you can apply this sort of thing. You can obviously apply it at a huge level, at a multinational level. You can also apply it in everyday life. My father wouldn't get pay television. He's 89. This is about 7 years ago. And bear in mind, you're born in 1930, you've paid the BBC license fee all your life, but you've never paid anything else for television because the rest of it's ad funded. And he said, no, it's £17 a month, it's too much. He's not interested in sport, not interested in movies, but he really, really loves documentaries and factual TV. And I said, well, I'll pay for it for you. I said, seriously, I don't mind. I said, it's worth it, I'll pay for it. No, it's still too expensive, even if you pay for it. And then I tried, the simplest kind of Don Draper kind of mind trick, which I said, well, it isn't £17 a month, it's 60 pence a day. What difference does that make? He's reasonable enough at maths to say that's pretty much the same amount. I said, yeah, but you spend £2 a day on newspapers. So if you spend £2 a day on newspapers, it's not that crazy paying 60p for something which gives you 10 news channels and 150, sharks and Nazis channels. Okay. Now, what was extraordinary? He said, I see what you mean. And not only did I not have to pay, he went and got it himself at his own expense and is now like the Wye Valley's biggest Sky advocate, going around his 88-year-old friends going, I can't believe you don't have Sky. Now, I didn't change anything about the price because obviously I don't work for Sky. I don't have that power. All I did is tell a different story about it. And that completely changed his emotional reaction.
Which was a pretty basic, logical pitch, really. It wasn't like there was any trickery in there, was there? It's just
no.
Change of angle.
It's a change of angle, which is £17 a month. Maybe you start to calculate that and you start to think of that as, what is it, £200 a year, which does seem quite a lot of money. But actually, if you compare it to what you spend on newspapers, or many people, what they spend on coffee, for example, it's kind of a rounding error.
Sharks and Nazi channels is the best description of that kind of thing I've ever heard, by the way.
No, he loves that factual stuff. Can't stand fiction, but anything factual, absolutely loves it.
It's an interesting.
I think there was a joke. There was a joke Discovery Channel documentary called "Sharks, Nazis of the Deep," which intended to combine the two together.
Cool.
Rory, your example is interesting because something I've read that you've mentioned in the past is that Rolls-Royce and Maserati stopped displaying their cars at car shows because they were too expensive for people who had been looking at those cheaper cars. So, you know, they took the Rolls-Royce and the Maseratis and they marketed them at plane and boat shows because a $300,000 car, by comparison, was something that ultimately became an impulse buy. You say that...
Absolutely right. Yeah, if you've been looking at a Learjet all day, you know, effectively it's like putting the chocolate next to the till. You know, a Maserati or a Rolls-Royce compared to a Learjet or a sort of 50-foot yacht is, you know, is pretty much spare change.
Yeah, it's incomparable.
And the way we react to it, there's some research on how long you have to be immersed in one price band before it affects you in another. But you can do this with price. You can do it with all sorts of things. Advertising often does it, where literally you turn a weakness into a strength. I mean, if you look at a lot of advertising slogans, good things come to those who wait, for Guinness, for example, reassuringly expensive for Stella Artois. And of course, the great one, you know, we're number 2, so we try harder for Avis. You know, in every respect, in, you know, America of the 1960s, being number 2 was a weakness until you flipped. Robert Cialdini's book Persuasion is very good on this. Until you divert attention towards the attitude of the staff as distinct from the capabilities of the organization, in which case suddenly it says we're not resting on our laurels. And by the way, I mean, possibly the greatest advertising line of all time, which is for De Beers and Diamonds, which is, how else does a month's salary last a lifetime, is a piece of sheer genius because it gives you an absolute anchor point. You know, to be absolutely honest, as a bloke, it never would have occurred to me in the absence of that line that you should spend a month's salary. You know, I'm kind of thinking around the week point, you know, maybe a fortnight. But you know, those kind of things are extraordinarily potent because if you want to sum it up in one thing, I'm so sorry that the delivery. If you want to sum it up in one thing, we don't perceive objective reality. What we perceive is actually heavily mediated by context. And if you change the context, you change the experience, even if you haven't changed the reality. Now, put very bluntly from a business point of view, changing context is often a hell of a lot cheaper than changing reality.
Yeah, of course. There's it's interesting, and you kind of it was something that I read on the Ogilvy website actually, Rory. It's because you've spoken a bit about kind of price and perception of price, but I think there's a lot more to kind of what you do on a day-to-day basis. So you mentioned that, you know, when you create these new opportunities, these new marketing strategies, it's not necessarily about outspending the next person. You don't look at Facebook ads and Instagram ads and think of these conceptual things that everyone else is thinking about. It's identifying new markets where you really try and resonate and empathize with the target customer or the client and create opportunities that don't necessarily go through standard channels, that sometimes are actually much lower cost to execute because they don't go through the standard exhausted channels that are overpriced. Can you talk to me a bit about kind of how you go about executing that?
At the very simplest level, okay, economics as a discipline, and I'm not dissing, you know, really great economists here. In fact, one of the greatest, Nicholas Gruen, you probably know, who lives in Melbourne. I always think Australian economists are actually particularly good because, a bit like Australian fauna, they've kind of evolved at a distance from everything else and are free to go their own way, so they're not prisoners of this standard Chicago school doctrine, you know. And Steve Keen's another great guy, actually, also Australian. But the basic assumption of people who've done Economics 101 is that people make a decision on the basis of, the assumption is perfect information and perfect trust. Now, under those assumptions, first of all, marketing wouldn't need to exist. It shouldn't exist, because everybody would know exactly how much they're prepared to pay for something for the resulting utility, and they'd completely trust the person who is making it or selling it. And so economics basically says you don't need to look at this context stuff at all. You don't need to look at epistemology, because everybody already exists in this state of perfect information where, bizarrely, and it's a mathematical impossibility, by the way, we can go into a supermarket which contains 40,000 items, and we can immediately decide which 400 items of those 40,000 in combination will maximize our utility. Okay, that's the assumption, which would take something like a supercomputer, I think, I don't know, half the age of the galaxy to actually decide in mathematical reality. But because of this assumption, economics often drives people towards the most expensive thing you can do, which is the only way we can therefore improve our market share and grow, is either by reducing the price or by materially changing the product so it offers greater utility. And as I showed with my dad, no, that's not true. You can just tell a different story about it, and the perceived value is completely transformed. Now, I'm not saying sometimes you shouldn't drop the price, although, by the way, you should also test putting the price up, because sometimes putting the price up actually sells more. You wouldn't believe this, and economists become actually invisibly angry when I mention this. But most people who've been involved in menu-based pricing will say, look, if a thing is just at the wrong price point, it won't sell because the price doesn't make any sense. So I'll give you a nice little thought experiment here. You've got two products, one of which is, this actually happened, by the way, recently, one of which is kind of better than the other, apparently, but the better product is cheaper than the less functional product. Now, an economist would say that's the easiest decision. That's an absolute slam dunk, no-brainer, because I've got greater utility, lower price. That's what I buy. If you look at what happens in reality, actually, nobody buys either of them, because they go that humans, not unrealistically, have evolved to use social epistemology. Okay, they don't just think what is relevant to me. They think what would someone else do in these circumstances, and they ask the second order question: if that product really were better, the guy who made it would charge more for it to make more money. So why the hell is it cheaper? That doesn't make any sense. Maybe there's something about it which is really, really crap that I don't know about. Or maybe nobody will pay a high price for this product because the brand has an appalling reputation. And this actually happened, There were two Nespresso, in a much smaller way. Nespresso introduced the Virtuo coffee machine, and they had the Virtuo and the Virtuo Plus. And for some weird reason of pricing, they priced them both at the same price. And I talked to people in stores. I went into stores and I said, well, why are these the same price? Because one's called the Virtuo and one's called the Virtuo Plus. At least make the Virtuo Plus $5 more. It's got an automatic opening lid rather than the manual lid. Right? So at least put $5 on the Virtuo Plus so people go, well, do I want to pay $5 for the opening lid, yes or no? Right? But they made them the same. And sure enough, all the people I spoke to in stores said, no, everybody asked me this. Someone did tell me once why, but I can't remember. And it was a major obstacle to purchase. Because if you can't actually make sense, if you can't actually construct a narrative where the relative price of things makes sense to you, you don't buy anything. I gave an example. There was one example with KFC, not in Australia, but somewhere else, where putting the price of a product up increased sales. Now, okay, this is a post-rationalization. The only reason I said test putting the price up is very simply that it's much more common in a menu setting for raising the price to increase sales. If you've got a lot of comparisons to be made in parallel, that tends to work disproportionately well. Now, if you assume that economics is true and the first thing you do when a product is underselling is drop the price, what you're doing is you're trying the single most expensive intervention first. Because there's nothing more expensive than dropping the price as a way of selling something. You're effectively bribing the customer to buy it, okay? You could try an ad campaign, you could try giving away free fries with the product and putting the price up. There are inordinate things you should try before you just drop the price, not least because once you establish a lower price, you'll never get back up again. It's a kind of irreversible step. That's why hotels don't go super cheap during a recession. It's because basically once you've sold your hotel room for $80 a night, you'll never get back to 200. And so my argument would be, look, why on earth economics tells people to sell things through the most expensive means before they've tried other alternatives is an extraordinarily costly approach to business. Now, my hunch, I think, with this KFC product is, roughly speaking, and this is true of me, certainly, you kind of go into KFC for two reasons. You either go in for a bargain or you go in for a treat. And something that's priced in the middle of those two things isn't a bargain and it isn't a treat. I often think, you've got to be very careful. There are brilliant products. I always think of the Volvo XC90, which I think is a fantastic car. And it kind of suffers in choice architecture because it isn't an SUV and it isn't an estate car. And, you've got to be sometimes careful because if you're in between two categories, it's just harder for the brain to make sense of what you are and compare you to something else.
Speaking of choices, Rory, a lot of our listeners to this podcast are digital startups. They do an awful lot of A/B testing. You have some thoughts on A/B testing?
Yeah, I think it's ultimately, it's the best kind of testing there is. And ultimately, when you can do it, and we've got to caveat the fact that you can't always test. Okay, I mean, not least in coronavirus. Okay, there's a very quick solution to the coronavirus crisis, but it would be highly unethical, which is to deliberately infect highly paid volunteers. And if you budgeted that and offered people $100,000, you could probably discover a lot of things about the currently unknown about the disease in a much shorter time. But I think rightly that's not considered an acceptable approach. Although an economist might debate that, by the way, an unethical economist would. But you can't always test because sometimes you've got to bet the farm on one thing or the other. Sometimes the media environment doesn't allow you to test. And we've got to be a bit careful about this because there's a tendency, I think, in advertising for people to overinvest in those areas where testing is both quick and mathematically easy, which might be digital, and underinvest in things which are highly effective but harder to quantify, like television. So we've got to be very careful about that you don't end up. The great phrase goes, people are using statistics, as a drunk uses a lamppost for support rather than illumination. And there's a great danger that people who are worried about their careers will always focus on the things where you can quantify and justify your decisions, because it's just much safer for your job that way, even if it isn't better for the brand. So we've got to be careful about that bias. But A/B testing, I think, the vital role that behavioral science plays, and I always say this, look, it's not a science in the sense of you come to me and I tell you, don't do this, do that, because that will work 27% better. There's never that level of certainty. And because of the importance of context, it's very dangerous to have completely generalizable rules, because in a different setting, the same thing will have the opposite effect. But what we do in behavioral science, I would argue, is we massively expand the solution set, because we'll say, actually, you should also try testing this, because I know it seems trivial and it doesn't seem to make much sense in objective terms, but in subjective and decision-making terms, it can be decisive. An example of that being, there was a telephone call center, and people had to choose between 3 levels of subscription to a paywalled publication. And we just added the sentence, you had to choose A, B, and C. And quite a lot of people couldn't decide, or decided they'd come back later, or didn't fundamentally convert. And we doubled the conversion rate, and more than doubled, in fact, by just adding the sentence, most people choose B. And that's just acknowledgement of the fact that we have a collective epistemology. We don't just value what we value, as economists think. We also value what other people value, because we use other people as a shortcut to decision making. I mean, if you think about it in evolutionary terms, if you're an antelope and you see loads of antelope running at high speed towards you, the logical reaction is to go, I don't know what the hell they're running from, but it's probably nasty for them, so it's probably nasty for me. So I'm going to try and run a bit faster than them. Whereas an economist would say, no, 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 what you need to do is, factor in your search costs, but you need to go and investigate the source of the anxiety. And so you have, by the way, these two very powerful forces in human behavior, which are habit, one, and social copying. And those are always very important because, contrary to the kind of objective perception or perfect information hypothesis, we use the behavior and evaluation of other people to inform our decisions. And indeed, it would be extremely wasteful if we didn't. A company that does this actually shows that you get much, much better returns the more things you test, disproportionately, okay? And so testing 5, 6, 7 things will disproportionately increase the chance that you stumble on something highly significant. And their theory for this is that if you only give people 2 things to test, they'll test logical but actually psychologically fairly boring interventions. Price might be one, whatever it may be. If people have 5 or 6 things to test, they have room to test things which are apparently either wacky or counterintuitive. And bizarrely, it's those things that are disproportionately likely to pay off. Now, by the way, there's a really important thing about A/B testing, which is another lesson for behavioral science. The reason you need to do it is it's human behavior that makes you money, not human attitude. You can be the most famous person in the world but make no money from it because fame or high opinion on its own doesn't translate to profit. Behavior does, specifically economic behavior, but other forms of behavior too. If you're an airline and you can nudge people from the 10 a.m. flight to the noon flight, which is less crowded and under less demand, that also makes you money. And so the other reason why testing is so vital is because of a huge lesson of behavioral science is that research doesn't cover the waterfront by any means. Okay, and that's because in evolutionary terms we don't have full introspective access to our own motivations or even to our own reasons. Most of the reasons for buying things are post-rationalizations that we concoct in retrospect. So, you tend to have what we call the 2 broken binoculars, which is people tend to use economic logic to make decisions, or they use research. And the problem is that both of these, even in combination, aren't complete and may be incredibly misleading. Because the real why of why people buy things is often quite deep in psychology, in parts of the brain which are kind of opaque to introspection. And so, or it may simply be that we don't want to tell anybody because we're slightly embarrassed. I mean, you occasionally get moments of extraordinary honesty in market research, but they're, incredible self-awareness. Once I had it in research on an online book shop, where this guy, he was a banker, I think, about 28. And after talking about books and his book buying habits for about, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. He'd had a few drinks and he said, "Can I be strictly honest with you?" And we said, "Go on then, what?" And he said, "Well, to be honest, I don't really like reading novels very much. I just find that if you've read a couple of Ian McEwan's, you can pull a better kind of girl." Okay. No, I have no doubt, by the way, this observation is true. I'm sure Ian McEwan is practically Tinder for a certain class of person. Okay, but it's very rare that people say that. They will happily spend an hour talking about literature without ever admitting that there's a kind of Darwinian ulterior motive to becoming reasonably well read.
What's your secret for finding out this kind of insight? Is it just going out and hanging out in shops and talking to people in pubs when that's allowed again, that kind of thing, or are there processes that you have?
It hugely helps to have the mind of a naturalist. In fact, one of the greatest books I've read by another economist, a guy called Robert H. Frank, who's a kind of evolutionary economist. He wrote one book called The Darwin Economy, and I think he's written another book called The Economic Naturalist. And his idea is you should he asked wonderful questions. So you go out, just as Darwin did, in effect, and you look at things that are weird, like the fact that finches all have different shaped beaks, or the peacock's tail, or whatever it happens to be. And you look at anomalies and you try and work out what underlies them. That's one really good approach. And so one of his great questions, which he asks his economics course at Cornell, I think it is why is it that people buy a wedding? Now, I don't fully know the answer to this. Why is it that people buy a wedding dress which they will only wear once, but the guys rent tuxedos for the wedding, whereas actually the opportunity to wear a tuxedo in life is probably, 50 or 60 occasions? And so he goes and finds complete anomalies in the way humans behave, which is exactly what Darwin did. You go around the world. There's a wonderful experiment where Darwin takes this large, huge lizard on an island, repeatedly picks it up and throws it in the sea. And every time he throws it in the sea, it just climbs back onto land, and he throws it in the sea again. And what he inferred from that is that because the lizard had evolved on an island where there were no predators, but there were predators in the sea, like sharks, it had evolved the preference that when in doubt, get back in land. And despite the fact that the island now contained a bloke with a beard who repeatedly lobbed you into the ocean, that preference was basically innate. It had become innate through evolution. And so one of the things I do is, first of all, the value of counterintuitive or unexpected information is much, much higher in a competitive setting than the value of things that people would have assumed anyway. So whenever you find something that doesn't seem to make sense, or which seems anomalous, or an effect which seems disproportionate, you should always seek to codify it and apply that finding as widely as you can. So look for things that don't make sense. And also, one of the things I say is, one, how would I put it? Ask really childish questions. And ask why 5 times in a row. Don't just ask why once, because the first answer to why is the official kind of logical sounding answer, which would get an economist nodding. You've got to find the 3rd or 4th why. I've asked the question, so stupid a question, that I don't think anybody's asked it in 50 years, which is, why don't people like standing up on trains? Okay. Now, obviously, people prefer a seat on a train to standing. We can take that as a given. And, the boring answer is because standing up is tiring and sitting down is relaxing. Okay? That would be the boring answer. So nobody's bothered to answer that question. But actually, if you could find out that the true answer was more complicated, you could solve the problem of train overcrowding in a completely different and imaginative way, without needing longer trains with less legroom, with, or faster trains. Because one of the things you might ask is it because, when you sit on a train, you get everything. You get a seat, you get a table, you get a plug, you get a view out of the window, you can read a book, you can drink a coffee, you can put your bag under your seat. If you stand, you lose the use of one arm. You can't use your mobile phone. You can't use a tablet or a laptop. You've got to hold on to a pole because otherwise you'll fall over, and you don't get to look out of the window. Well, what if you design trains so there's a bit of a trade-off between the two? So people who'd actually been forced to stand, some people would choose to stand, and some people who are forced to stand could construct a story where they didn't mind. So if you put the seats in the middle and you didn't give them the table, you just gave them a cup holder, but all along the edge of the train there were ledges for laptops with a couple of USB chargers, a hook to hang your bag, a bum rest to lean on, and a nice view out of the window, okay? You've actually created a train where probably people under 40 who've been sitting at a desk all day might well choose to stand for a 30-minute journey. And because the question sounds so fatuous and stupid, my confident expectation is no one in a meeting has risked looking like a tosser to the extent of asking that question. And that's exactly the reason why you've got to ask it. And so the other one is assume if there's a problem that there have been decisions in the design of that product or the design of that experience or service which have been taken by logical people. And if you can find the logical assumption in something that, although logical, is wrong, because this is a really important thing in human decision making. Just because something makes sense doesn't mean it's right. Okay, humans are very, very good at back-forming a plausible sounding explanation for more or less anything. And then having done that, we basically say, right, that's the truth. Because it makes sense, I'm going to treat it as if it's true. And logic's not a terrible filter. I'm not suggesting you should explain everything by reference to fairies or magical powers. But quite often the reason things happen for an entirely different reason to the ones people think. You know, I've spent a lot of time. One of the things I regard as Fermat's last theorem for understanding human behaviour is bizarrely why video conferencing, what we're doing now, took so long to take off, and in fact took a pandemic before it became universally adopted. When you think about it in simple, rational terms, even in economic terms, you've got the choice between what we're doing now. Now, are you in Melbourne or Sydney?
Both Sydney.
You're both in Sydney.
Yeah.
I have days, okay, where I literally start the day talking to Sydney or Melbourne, and then I move west to sort of Singapore, then Tbilisi, Georgia, then yesterday it was actually Croatia, and then on to, say, Atlanta, Georgia, which is what happened yesterday, pretty much. Now, my employer could give me a Learjet. I wouldn't be able to do that, right? It's an extraordinary superpower. The quality actually is, it's not far off broadcast quality the way I'm seeing you now. I mean, you've probably got a pretty nice bit of bandwidth. But now the fact that, no, I'm not suggesting, I'm not one of these idiots who goes, you know, in the future, no one will travel at all and everything will be done virtually. I'm not suggesting that. You know, there are huge reasons why you need to travel and why you want to visit things physically. But the ratio, I'll give you an anecdote of this. Someone very senior at WPP, worked for Sir Martin Sorrell for, you know, about 8 years. And Martin was the kind of guy who'd say, I need you to come to Brussels tomorrow morning to meet me for breakfast to discuss this balance sheet issue. And so he was quite frequently, you know, forced to hop on a plane, on a train or whatever to go and meet Martin wherever he was. He said, in the entire 8 years, we met over video once. Now, it's impossible, I mean, literally statistically impossible, that on all those 130 occasions, on at least 20 of those occasions, or maybe 50, it wouldn't have made sense to do it by video rather than face-to-face. They knew each other really well already. It wasn't as if this guy was a total stranger, okay? What is it that's so deeply embedded in patterns of human behavior? Is it driven by status? In other words, my convening power, my ability to get people to jump around reinforces my ideas of status? Is it because travel is a costly signal, which is we prove to our clients how unbelievably committed we are to their business, not by actually doing good, worthwhile work in the time available, but by getting on a plane to Frankfurt at 6 o'clock in the morning? But there's something wrong there.
So
you know, there's something badly wrong.
So it's basically the dance monkey syndrome.
It could be dance monkey, which is interesting, which is that people actually enjoy the fact. I mean, on the other hand, this is a terrible thing to say, and I shouldn't say it out loud, but one of the great things about video calls is you can postpone, move, I don't cancel them, but you can move them or postpone them if something really urgent crops up. You know, the number of times I've been meeting someone in London physically and something really urgent crops up where I really need to attend this brainstorm on whatever it is because there's a really pressing problem, but someone's traveled to London to see you, and therefore if you postpone them by 2 hours, you are dicking them around. Whereas on a video call, you just go, can't do Friday, what about Monday? Yep, fine. Nobody's offended, nobody's upset. So you can prioritize your time so much better. And also, a meeting doesn't need to last an hour, right? Why do meetings last an hour? Because we used to be in Canary Wharf on the outskirts of London, which took about 40 minutes to get to, because it was right to the Far East. You couldn't meet anybody for less than an hour and a quarter, because if if they travel all the way out there, you gave them 20 minutes of your time and then they sent them off again, you felt you were dicking them around. You know, you had to give them at least an hour and a half of your time just to respect the commitment they'd made in the journey. And so there are all these distortions in behavior. And Japanese toilets are another area, but where, in a logical world, they'd have, how are they doing in Australia? Are you starting to get into the Japanese toilet a bit? Because in Europe, I mean, seriously, I think only 1% of Toto's sales are to Western Europe.
Yeah, right.
But if you've used a Japanese toilet, it is an order of magnitude better as a shitting and wiping experience than a conventional toilet. There's, okay, some of the reasons are economic, but some of them I think are embarrassment. That nobody wants to be seen as the family with the weird toilet. Now, why that's important is, well, it's obviously important if you're Toto or Jebered, but the other reason why it's important is the same rule probably applies to solar panels on your house, that selling the first lot in the street is disproportionately difficult.
Yeah.
Because if you're the only people in the street, and therefore lies, a platform for a sales strategy, which is if someone has solar panels, go and sell to the neighbors. But B, possibly a platform for psychologically informed government intervention, which is in any postal district, you subsidize the first 8, and then you allow natural human copying instinct to take up the slack.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Rory, I want to kind of rewind a little bit there. You mentioned getting in a plane and going to a meeting and doing that in person, even though it may only be a couple of hours, or maybe it's a whole afternoon, right? I think part of it's fear. I think part of it's fear of losing that account or that client or that customer. And I think we build up this perceived reality that, even though I've been working with this individual for 3, 4, 5, 6 years, if I don't put in that extra effort and someone else would, then I'm now the odd one out and I can be discarded.
So this happens in advertising agency pitching. It's a huge problem because what is a tissue session, and should be a tissue session, by the way, because in a tissue session, if you haven't invested too much time in presentation, the client can speak more honestly to you about routes on the grounds that, if someone has actually produced the thing on vellum with getting monks to do illustrated letters in your tissue session, which is kind of the way it's going, where everybody goes a bit further than everybody else, then a client can't really go, look, mate, your strategy sucks, because he's going to go, Jesus, they've just spent $20,000 doing this. I can't really piss all over it, right? Now, in a way, we think we're being clever, but I don't think we are. I think we're being stupid, actually. We by the way, if you look at the money and time and mental effort invested in travel, by which you have to include things like learning to drive, insuring your car, getting good at using airports, which has taken me literally 15 years of practice before I can actually breeze through an airport without cocking something up, okay? And then you look at the amount of mental effort we put into getting good at video conferencing. Or remote working for that matter. I mean, the first thing I said to all my staff, for God's sake, when you're at home, we're going to be at home for weeks. Are you seriously going to try and do this on a laptop for 6 weeks? Get a monitor, however you can. Buy a 4K TV, fix it to the wall and plug your laptop in. Because if you're trying to work from home on an 11-inch screen, you'll go nuts after about a week and a half. But equally, there are people who, there are pieces of equipment. The Meeting Owl is an extraordinary thing from Owl Laboratories. That's about $1,000. A professional microphone. Am I right in saying that Rode are actually an Australian brand? Is that right? It's probably pronounced Rode, is it?
I've always noticed. I was unaware of that. I own a lot of microphones.
Someone told me that
it could be right.
Yeah. But a Rode microphone is 100. A really good webcam, although you can't buy them now. Interestingly, Amazon sold out. Really good 4K webcams. These things are kind of rounding errors compared to what we spend on transportation, and yet almost nobody's invested in them at all. Actually, very interesting story. We kind of won a bit of business from a very large client because we had a Meeting Owl. And so we'd had this, it looks like an owl. It sits in the middle of a table and it's got a 360-degree camera on its head. Disclosure, I'm such an advocate for the Meeting Owl that they did send me one for free because I'd spent so much time evangelizing this thing. But it uses an array of directional microphones and it's got 3 speakers as well. And it intelligently zooms in on whoever's speaking. And if 2 or 3 people around the table are speaking, it creates kind of diptych or a triptych. It splits the screen to show everybody who's talking simultaneously, even if they're sitting opposite to each other. Genius thing. And we actually won a huge bit of business because we had a Meeting Owl. Because we came into the physical meeting and they said, you're the guys with the really cool video conferencing. So you can actually do it the other way. Now, which would you rather work with? Every agency is prepared to fly out and see you because there's a pitch. But I'd rather work with an agency that actually, if I needed to hold a meeting at 7 a.m., they would do it, and their video calling, albeit from home, would be reasonably competent, and they could do it at short notice, rather than the agency who's desperate to hop on a plane at the slightest possible kind of reason.
Question for you, Rory. As a as an ex-creative director, we kind of applied your thinking to our business in that we observed a lot of businesses in our field that were owned by private equity types and just went, okay, there's not many rules, but rule one is whatever the private equity people would do, we do the opposite of that. And it works.
That, by the way, is a brilliant approach to more or less everything. The weird thing about private equity holding is even though everything they do seems logical, the customer can kind of feel it, can't they?
Yes, they
John
can.
Kay, who's an economist, brilliant economist and writer for the FT in London. He had lunch with someone and he said, since we last ate here 5 years ago, I'm kind of getting the feeling they've been taken over by private equity. And they went and got their phones out. Sure enough, a year before, they'd been taken over. And whether it's the portion size or the slightly grudging way with which things are done. And I would go even further than that. I'd say the first requirement to creating a great brand is the ability to do something that the finance director doesn't like.
Cool.
And the classic example of that is the DoubleTree hotel chain. I always talk about this, where they give you a warm cookie when you check in, a bag of hot cookies, because they have an oven under the check-in desk. Anecdote tells me that the finance director has been trying to kill this for years. Rather sweetly, during coronavirus, they released the recipe for the cookies online so that people could make them at home, which I thought was rather a sweet touch. But the point is that no other hotel does this. That's the whole point, right? Now a logical person would say, okay, wait, the first thing a financial director kills is the cherry on top, because his definition of value is all about the functional value of something, which is, room size, you can imagine the whole thing, the utilization rate. Actually, one of the interesting questions I ask is that airlines have got so good at yield management that flying has become, I'm sure it's become a bit cheaper and a bit more profitable, but it's also become a bit of an arse, because actually a plane with no spare seats is a fucking awful plane to board. Okay, because one person has a broken seat and there's no one else for them to go. Half the blasted boarding time is spent with people playing Tetris with the overhead lockers, trying to get their stupid luggage in because you have to pay to put it in the hold. And I would argue that over-optimization starts off healthy. Don't get me wrong. I'm not promoting waste here. But over-optimization, as with long supply chains and just-in-time manufacturing when there's a pandemic, okay, in the short term, it looks clever. In the long term, it fragilizes you or makes you actually slightly unpleasant. Because consumers value efficiency up to a point. They don't want money to be spent in things they can't see necessarily. But they really, really hate it when it becomes palpable, when you feel that essentially, the whole business is just optimized around separating you from your money on the basis of a one-off transaction rather than a prolonged, repeated relationship. And I think your strategy is absolutely right. Think what private equity would do, and where it's noticeable, do the opposite.
Well, we've found it to be, and you speak of being able to tell. You can tell private equity ownership by the staff's cold, dead eyes. We've kind of found it to be profitable and a lot of fun. Question though, if you don't have business owners or investors that feel that way, how do you sell alchemy as a good thing to the spreadsheet police? How do you get them across the line?
Well, one great advantage is behavioral science, particularly when it calls itself, slightly dishonestly, behavioral economics. You can talk to the whole C-suite. Marketing has developed a vocabulary which is fine when you're talking to other marketers, but is a disaster when you're talking to a finance director. If you talk to a finance director about brand iconography, that's not a comfortable space for him. That's like going to the head of thoracic surgery at St. Thomas's Hospital and saying, we trust to the healing power of the crystal. It's total wacko stuff as far as they're concerned. And behavioral economics reframes what we do in language and indeed frameworks that they have to respect and pay attention to. The second thing is, and this is another thing, by the way, which is a tip to your agency, the entire creative agency world shot itself in the foot when it moved from payment by commission to payment by the hour. Because in many ways, payment by the hour is worse. It's a terrible way of being paid because the time we spend is not remotely representative of or correlated with the value we create. I mean, the weird thing, the reason I love behavioral science is you can create 5 million quid in an afternoon. out of your head, right? And how you get paid for that, that's a problem we're wrestling with to an extent. But the weirdest thing that agencies did is they suddenly went over to payment by the hour, and yet their muscle memory was so strong, they continued behaving as if they were only paid on commission. Don't confine yourself, okay, where are the values created? The communication is valuable. I'm not for a second disparaging advertising, which can be absolutely transformative. However, two things. One, don't start with the advertising. Why? Start close to the point of sale, or indeed repeat sale. Start at the end of the funnel and optimize working backwards. Because if the end of the funnel's no good, then the best advertising campaign in the world might not work, right? If everybody buys your product once and never buys it again, that's the problem you've got to solve. Because a great advertising campaign would just create ultimately more disappointed customers at speed. So the first thing advertising does, it starts talking at the brand ethereal level before it has conversations about, where else you could sell it, the choice architecture presented on the website, the modes of payment you can use. Okay, just to give an example of a total flaming weird thing. Men's clothing, right? All blokes have a favorite shirt. But the tragedy is you can never find a second version of your favorite shirt. Why don't men's shirts have QR codes or codes in them which say, if you want to reorder this in the same color or a different color, go here? Okay, because about 7 times in my life I've bought an item of clothing where I go, if only I'd known, I would have bought 4. It doesn't work for women's clothes. I know this because occasionally I buy my wife a copy of something she already owns, and I can see in the the palpable disappointment that this doesn't work for women. But you really like the first one. And women's, I think the fear is that everybody thinks, if I do that 10 times, everybody thinks you only own one sweater or something, right? Blokes don't give a shit about that, to be honest. But so first of all, you've got to optimize going backwards and leave the brand talk till last until you've optimized everything else. Apart from everything else, if there's a huge danger that your data is distorted, for example. If you make too early a punt about who your target audience is, the people you're selling to might not be a product of who wants your product. It might be a product of the choice architecture around your product. And so if you haven't experimented widely with that, you might have a far too narrow view of who your potential customer base is. So you've got to do it backwards. There's a great book by a guy called Eli Goldratt called The Goal, where he calls this bottleneck theory, effectively. And bottleneck theory is, look, in any system, the first place to intervene is the place where the constraint exists. There's no point in widening a road if there's a badly phased set of traffic lights 200 yards down the road. Fix the traffic lights, and then you'll find out whether you need to widen the road. Okay? Now, the second thing that advertising did, which was totally whack when it moved to payment by the hour, it completely failed to spot the fact that we were no longer confined to doing work for people with large media budgets. And you still get this, in our new business team, we go, we've got a project from the Thames Valley Police. And now I'm ecstatic to work with the Thames Valley Police because the police have, they're actually great people to work with because they have a fantastic kind of executional and open-minded approach to what they do. They're really, really great. But secondly, they've got a huge raft of really interesting psychological problems and issues, which you can, at the very least, if we can't solve them, we can expand the solution space. We can say, well, traditionally you'd look at punishment or arrest, but have you looked at responding with, can you do me a favor, right? Because sometimes that's the best thing for a cop to do. I know the guy's a bit of a miscreant, but actually, by not telling the guy off, reverse psychology may mean he's more likely to change his behavior. There's a very, very weird thing in psychology which no airline's ever deployed, which is weirdly, we don't just like people who do favors for us. We like people more when we do favors for them. And I've repeatedly said to airlines, if you've got a flight that's overbooked at 10:30 and a flight that's half empty at 11:30, if you ring up 10 passengers and go, there's no obligation, you're booked on the 11:30 flight, but it would do us a favor if you switch your flight to an hour later. Weirdly, those people will like you more because they've helped you out. Okay, now that's a really important finding because an economist would say we must find a bribery mechanism to shift people from one flight to another. And then now the crazy thing is, and I can see when you go to the new business people, you go, we got to work for the Thames Valley Police, which is to me is like, you know, manna, right? You can see them going, oh, you know, I don't suppose they spend very much on media. I think that's not the fucking point. You know, I mean, first of all, who needs a large media budget when you can arrest people, right? I mean, Unilever can't do that. First of all, okay, you know, you don't need to whack a load of money to Rupert Murdoch when you got the powers of arrest and detention. But leaving that aside, okay, that's irrelevant. The value created in a creative agency, not a media agency, is a mixture of, I would argue, creative ideation, human insight, and, you know, real world iterative testing. That's the value. The means you use to deploy those things is entirely irrelevant to the value you create. And so if you think about it, imagine if management consultants had decided, okay, we're not going to solve a wide range of business problems. We're just going to focus on people who go to Cannes. Okay. You know, the people who don't go to Cannes have, you know, combined budgets which are 1,000 times larger than the people who do. Now, just so you haven't got a media budget doesn't mean you haven't got a problem to be solved.
Cool.
You know, the existence of management consultancies shows that you can make large amounts of money by the hour, not always in a very worthwhile way, I would argue, because it tends to be, you know, just further pumping up the efficiency bubble. But nonetheless, that extraordinary self-limiting belief among advertising people that if we don't get to produce an ad, we won't be producing any value. Now, I'm not the first person to spot this. A guy called Howard Luck Gossage, back in the 70s in San Francisco, created a kind of behavioral science practice which was called Generalists Inc. And the whole point was, look, the talent you can find within an ad agency can solve a far wider range of human and societal problems than we're currently given to solve. And most good creatives, by the way, know this instinctively.
The alchemy thinking works really well for business. Now that everyone's all locked in together, do you personally have any insider tips on how to use that kind of thinking to just get on better with your family and live a better non-business life?
We've written a guide to this, actually, and one of the things we do is we, as a group of 15 people, we get online simultaneously. Something, by the way, that in the physical world, surprisingly difficult to do, because there are always 7 people who are at a client or whatever, but we get online simultaneously and check up on each other, because one of the reasons why video conferencing is so important psychologically is, as humans, we kind of thrive on attention. You know, the extent to which we are paid, and it's very interesting we use the phrase pay attention. You know, that's an interesting kind of grammatical construction in itself. But the extent to which we receive attention does matter to us a lot. And there's a really important thing, I think, with video conferencing. One of the things, the odd thing about my team, so I'm not the best person to speak about this, because I was a Zoom advocate and a meeting owl advocate probably about 1.5 years ago, and I kept evangelizing for this. And what I discovered, which is quite valuable, is you can win business over video. You can't win business over email, basically, okay? And if you think about it like this, okay, one of the things that annoys me about public transport is there's a huge gap between mass transit and a taxi, you know. So you either basically get on a crowded underground thing and pay £1.50, or if you want to use your phone on the journey, you have to pay 23 quid. You know, I've always thought that driverless electric pods that travel at only 10 miles an hour, where to some extent the duration of the journey is part of the benefit, okay. If you could pay £4 for one of those, you know, it would fill this huge gap. Now, if you think about international business, but actually all business, there's this yawning gap between Slack, email, and phone calls and meeting people face to face. And the low sunk costs of a video call are magical because it pays you now to meet people where previously you wouldn't have taken the risk. Now, yesterday, now, you know, I'm not stereotyping. I come from the same part of the world, okay? I discovered that there was this kind of tech cluster in Gloucester, okay? And I think it must be related to GCHQ, which is the Government Intelligence Service, which is in Cheltenham. And now, you know, there were 3 people there with extraordinarily interesting new business ideas, okay? Now, in the physical world, if we hadn't had coronavirus, the likelihood that, I would have, said, I'm off to Gloucester now to discover interesting tech businesses, it would have seemed like a completely deranged thing. So the value of maximizing serendipity is really high here. Now, in terms of using behavioral science to cope with lockdown, we've got to acknowledge the fact to start with that there are hugely different personality types. So people who are not exclusively but largely introvert will quite often, either secretly or overtly, will say they quite like this. And there are a lot of people I notice saying, I'm not going back to the status quo when this is over. I'm not going back to 5 days a week. Now, think of the problems, by the way, that could be solved if we adopted a degree of flexible working. Now, I'm not suggesting for anybody, 1 second, that you get rid of the physical office at all, but you can shrink it. You could even share it with another business, conceivably, for 1.5 days of the week, if you wanted to, right? Because the pensions crisis. I think most people retire not because they want to give up work, because they want to give up commuting. That's why they retire. It's not that accountants mind doing accounts. It's that if I've got to get up at 7 o'clock every morning, 5 days a week, and travel on a train for 45 minutes before I can do it, price isn't worth paying at the age of 60. Well, I'm 54. I get sick of it myself, right? Secondly, the housing crisis. If you had 3 days a week spent where you live and 4 in the office, and sometimes that was 4 days a week spent where you live and 3 in the office, would you necessarily want to live in central Sydney anymore? Now, a lot of people would still say yes, okay? But a hell of a lot of people would go, shit, I could actually own a pod in Sydney where I crash, okay? And own something overlooking, a bit of a lake or the coast or something, right? Particularly, by the way, and this is a particular rant of mine, if people are fed a lot of urbanist propaganda, aren't they? Okay, so if TV programs are all produced by people who live in cities, and they all create the idea that basically if you're in a city, there are loads of sophisticated, really right on, liberal, kind and generous people, and the second you travel 5 miles away, it's deliverance, basically. Okay, now one of the things that's slightly painful about the internet is it makes large cities more and more overproductive in terms of the generation of economic value, that when you reach a kind of mega city size. And the extraordinary thing about Australia, when you think about it, is you've produced 2 world-class mega cities out of a population of what, 27 million? It's 30 now. But when you think about it, you're a long way from anywhere, and yet you've got these 2 spectacular conurbations, which are on a par with, actually better than New York, London, Paris. An incredible thing to have done. Now, they're incredibly productive economically because of the extent to which you can perform complex economic work when you have people with a lot of different complementary skills in close proximity. And so cities have become more and more necessary to earning money, but they become less and less necessary to spending it. So, bluntly put, okay, it used to be that London was a better place to earn money than the countryside, but it was also a better place to spend it. Now, there's some areas where that's still true. When I moved out to the suburbs, I missed Lebanese restaurants. I missed Korean restaurants. The Indian restaurants are just as good, by the way. There's no particular correlation, by and large. You can find great curry anywhere in Britain. It's one of our great miracles. I've had a French colleague who said that's what she loved about Britain, that you could find fantastic Indian food in the most unexpected places. The best bookshop in the world is no longer in London. If I want to buy high-end hi-fi equipment, that's no longer a trip to London. Actually, for consumption purposes, we need London less and less, just as for earning purposes, we need it more and more. And that's slightly cruel, because you're forcing people to pay London rents, which basically wipes out a lot of the economic value being created. Being a bit of a Georgist here in economic terms, but land value and land prices wipe out most of those economic gains created through the spectacular efficiency of megacities. Now, if you enable people to game the system where they have a London salary, but Rochester housing costs, Rochester, Kent, not Rochester, New York, okay, that's kind of nirvana, really.
So you could get a chateau like David Ogilvy. Did he have
a chateau? That's the wonderful thing I have at Ogilvy, which is, our founder worked from home for the last 12 years of his life. And by the way, he's also on record as saying he never wrote anything in the office. So his books were written at home. He wrote ad copy at home because he couldn't write in the office because there were too many distractions. Which is true of me, but true of me, by the way. Since the open plan office, I go home to write. If I've got anything substantial to write, I always go home to do it because it's just. So one of the things we're looking at, by the way, sorry, I haven't answered your first question. I've gone off on a complete tangent, but apologies. One of the things we're looking at is making the office more bifurcated. So basically, you have two offices, and part of it in one. Part of it's hypersocial. You know, it's meetings, recognition. You know, paying attention to people, talking, serendipitous meetings, and part of it's kind of like a withdrawal space where almost the rules are you don't talk to each other, because that's for people. Because some people, I'm perfectly happy working from home. There are a lot of people who don't like working from home because they like to compartmentalize their work life and their home life. And so having a space in the office where introverts can go and, oh, thank you very much indeed, can go and self-isolate. And I think the done thing with open plan is it's neither what is it, fish nor fowl. Okay, in that it's not private, but it's not really sociable. You know, people send emails to people across the table. You can't hold a video conference because it's too noisy. Okay. And that was one of the obstacles. The open plan office came in just as video calling came in and almost served to wipe out many of the benefits. And so first of all, there's that. Then there's the second thing, which is really interesting. Yeah. What do you do at home? It makes a huge difference if you have a garden. Someone trapped in with a flatmate they hate or someone alone is going to have a much worse time of it than someone. I've got my own family. My kids are 18. That's fine. In fact, for the first time in 18 years, one of them actually performed a useful function for me by bringing me a coffee, which is, you know, that's a bit of a kind of Damascus moment. Milestone, absolutely. And now, if you've got two young children and two parents are juggling childcare duties while the other one's on a conference call or trying to purge your email, that makes it tougher. Mm. The only answer is it all depends. I think this, and the solution is, look, we don't know what the right ratio is, okay? What we do know is that 100-0 is not the right ratio for most office work. Mm. And I have heard repeated stories of people who've experienced an epiphany. You know, it's exactly like that person who video conferenced with Martin Sorrell once. You know, we don't know what the right amount of the right balance is, but now, this, by the way, is a behavioural science question, because I argue in many cases, because social pressure and norms exert a restriction on our behaviour, so that up till now, even people who loved working remotely couldn't do it because you're in danger of becoming stereotyped as the office lazy guy. Okay, you see it in that way in which people say working from home in audible inverted commas, don't you? Oh, he's working from home today. Yeah. Now, my own experience has been, on balance, if I spend about little under half the week working from home, maybe even half, I'm more productive than if I spend less time doing that. It also, as a night owl, it's also good because I can work late in the evenings when there are no distractions. And then, you know, I don't have to get, you know, if I have a 9 o'clock meeting the next day, I get up at, in my case, 9:10, as you noticed, but I can get up at 9 rather than getting up at 7. It makes a huge difference. Just not commuting in itself adds about, you know, my guess would be a day to the working week. Okay, you gain a productive day of the week. This is the first opportunity for a white-collar productivity transformation. It's particularly valuable to us as Brits because we're on the Greenwich Meridian and we can do it with everybody, okay? It's also particularly valuable with you in Australia because this is not blowing smoke up your ass. I love working with Australians, Canadians, and New Zealanders, and I'll tell you why, okay? Generally in Brits, you get intelligent people and you get practical people, but the two things are not found in the same place. What I notice about Kiwis, Aussies, and Canadians is you get people who are equally practical and intelligent. So there's a mixture of intelligence and common sense. I think it must be something to do with some frontier thing you've got going on. I don't know what it is. But this is not just because I'm talking to Australians. I say this routinely, that there's something really impressive there. And So you've got a developed economy. New Zealand, for example, this is a godsend, because you may end up working some pretty weird hours in New Zealand, but you've now got a whole world to sell to. Actually, working weird hours if you live in New Zealand might be rather nice, because one of the best moments of my working life was when I was in California for 3 weeks. And I used to get up at about 8 o'clock in the morning. I'd deal with everything in the office. I'd make a few phone calls and have a video call. By lunchtime, they'd all gone home. And I had the rest of the afternoon to myself. It was glorious.
Cool.
So being on a weird time zone might be an advantage as well. Now, as for the home stuff, it's incredibly individualized. So introverts will like it, extroverts will be driven insane. But even among the extroverts, I think we've noticed a degree of conversion. And the reason was that when video conferencing was only 5% of what we did, the downside was noticeable, but the upside wasn't. It took a mass enforced experiment like this for people to really discover the potential. And the other thing I think which was significant, which is one of my theories, is that coach travel, right? The last time I went on a coach was 1983 or something. And I have an absolute horror of coach travel because it was a 3-hour journey with no onboard toilet, with no piss break. And my impression of coach travel is still stuck in the 1980s. I think the problem with video calling was that when it was not novel, it was crap. And by the time it stopped being crap, it was no longer novel. Okay? So people tried it when in the early days, and they thought, "Ooh, just as we tried you might have tried. No, you're too young. The Cambridge Live Cam coffee pot, which I must have visited 30 times because it was the first ever webcam on the web, and it just showed the level of coffee. So people in this Cambridge damp laboratory knew whether if they went down to the coffee place, they'd have to spend a load of time making coffee, or whether they could just use the coffee in the pot." Okay. Now, I must have visited that 30 or 40 times out of sheer novelty. I don't think I would now. Although I have got into slow TV, by the way. There's some stuff on YouTube. I have, this is a terrible embarrassment. It's just a little bit of self-revelation. I've spent probably 8 hours in the last week watching sales pitches from American RV salesmen. Luxury motorhomes. And what I've discovered, by the way, Australia produces these fantastic trailers and motorhomes, like kind of all-purpose 4x4 motorhomes. They're these Australian brands I've never heard of. They're brilliant. You should come and export them, for God's sake.
My dad got right into motorhoming when I was small kids, and we traveled around Europe. And he, after he stopped working, he started a motorhome club. Even though he was a massive introvert and fucking hated banter, he ended up with like 65,000 members, and they have these rallies in small towns like the World Cup, and they show drone photos. Just go, I had no idea there were that many motorhomes. So yeah, it's an entire world.
What I love about that is that on YouTube, someone else's obsession can contribute to your interest. So, I'm not sure I'd ever want to become a total motorhome obsessive. But actually, what's wonderful about this is often introvert people, because introverts tend to be obsessive, now have the technology to share what they know with people who are more borderline. And it's an extraordinary, but I mean, discovering Australian, it's not so bad. They're often green, aren't they? And they've got chunky tires, and you tow them behind a car. Shit, if you started the Aussie Motorhome Centre in London, right, at the Aussie Motorhome and Camping Centre, you would totally clear up. I've never realised this whole ecosystem out there. It was like discovering the duck-billed platypus or the black swan or the kangaroo. Shit, Australian camping, fantastic stuff. Yeah,
that's not too bad. Rory, you mentioned something earlier that I find really intriguing, which is like you're identifying correctly. There's this huge paradigm shift. Introverts are loving working from home. Extroverts are going absolutely insane. I fall into the category of the former, so I'm loving it.
I love it. No, the reason is, don't forget, okay, extroverts can bully introverts, but it never happens the other way around, right? So the people who want to do things, the people who want to walk another 5 miles or climb another mountain can bully the rest of the group. And that's a fundamental asymmetry. If you go to Everest Base Camp, okay, you don't get a load of people going, look, there's going to be a queue at the fucking top. The weather's terrible. Why don't we just stay in the tent and read Proust, okay? No, don't go up here. Come and stay in my tent and read Proust with me, right? Yeah. You can't do that as an introvert. So the extroverts end up setting what you might call, it's an asymmetry, a bit like blood donation. AB can give to O, but not the other way around, or whatever it is. Probably the other way around, actually. You can give AB blood to an O, but you can't give O blood to an AB, or whatever it is. And in the same way, this asymmetry, I think, has distorted working life so that it's increasingly introvert unfriendly.
Yeah.
And I think after this is over, we should create introvert rights. And, we should have, it's identity politics, basically. We should use the tools of identity politics to go, no, I'm afraid your trip to Frankfurt is basically wildly prejudiced against introverts, so I can't allow it. Because that's really how the world works. Yeah.
No, it is. Yeah. But it's interesting. Like you mentioned that there's this huge paradigm shift, and I agree. I couldn't echo your words more, because it's something that crossed my mind about 3-4 weeks ago, which is that the full-time 5 business days in the office could very likely change. The idea of 2 companies sharing the same office could become a reality. And with what you do in behavioral science, with working with psychologists to ask these questions that people aren't commonly asking, what sorts of questions should we be asking ourselves right now? Because realistically, the paradigm is shifting massively. What sort of questions should we be asking ourselves?
Well, first of all, I think introverts have to form an awkward squad so that we don't allow people to bully us back. Fortunately, the slow unlocking of the lockdown, the gradual unlocking of the lockdown, will mean that nobody can just say, right, Monday, everything starts just as it did before, because your elevator is currently optimized to take as many people per journey as it possibly can, which is a disaster in terms of virus spreading. So offices will have to reopen gradually. And the simple thing I think there is that, the very simple thing there is that we have to fight to say, let's find a new equilibrium. And complexity theorists understand this. You get equilibria in social complex systems where you can jolt the system to a new equilibrium, but often it requires something like war, famine, disease before the change gets made. I would argue that a role of government is kind of libertarian legislation, which is to say that there's an MP for Faversham in London called Kent called Helen Whately. And she before this happened, she introduced legislation which said when you advertise a job, it has to be assumed to offer flexible working by default, and you have to state a good reason why not if you don't offer flexible working. Now, it still allows companies the freedom to employ people on non-flexible terms, but it prevents non-flexible terms being the default form of employment. And what was interesting, by the way, she did it very much with working mums in mind. She formerly worked for, I think, Bain or McKinsey or someone, and had been a working mum. Much to her amazement, she got as much support from males for purely selfish reasons as from the female audience. And a load of people, bear in mind, okay, just as you have herd immunity, where there's a theory now going around in London that from the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, and someone called Gomes, who's a Portuguese scientist, that actually by the time the most susceptible 10 to 20% have created coronavirus and the remaining people have a lower coefficient of susceptibility, you might only need 10 to 20% infection to get to herd immunity. Now, I think the problem is with video calling historically is you only needed one arsehole boss, and he killed flexible working for 30 people. And equally, you only needed to have one really keynote colleague at work. I mean, the great luck I have in promoting this is being a vice chairman. There's no one else who's a vice chairman, so I'm not generally submitted to much comparison, okay? And so I'm free to do things differently. Now, let's imagine there were 2 vice chairmen and the other one was always getting in at 7 o'clock in the morning and going around being really visible. It would be more or less impossible for me to drive flexible working to the extent I did. And what I found with my own team is, this is why I'm not very qualified to talk about the experience, is because weirdly, before this even happened, I was mandating flexible working with my team. So we had kind of mandatory Zoom Fridays where we all worked remotely on a Friday. Because I realized that unless you actively encourage it, no one will ever adopt it off their own bat. And it was partly informed, my PA before my current PA was a single parent. And being a behavioral science nut, the way I approach everything in life is there's probably a more intelligent way we can think about this. You know, the natural default of something is X. That has been arrived at through habit and social copying and social norms. There must be a better way we can look at this. And so I said, look, okay, there are loads of things you could do which make you better as a parent and make you better as a PA. I don't want you on the tube at 9 o'clock in the morning. 9 o'clock in the morning is exactly where I need to get hold of you because I can't find the meeting I'm supposed to be attending, okay? The last place I want you to be is on the tube. I'd much rather you're taking your son to school at 9 o'clock in the morning and you got in at 10, okay? Similarly, I did things like I posted all my expenses to her home, and that way, after her son had gone to bed, she could then watch the telly and do the expenses, which was the best time of the day to do them, which gave her then free time when her son was awake to spend with her son. And so what we did is we just said, look, there are a few hours of the week where we both need to be synchronized. We both need to be in the same place at the same time. And there are a few hours of the week where we both need to be available to each other simultaneously. But for most of the week, we can actually stagger this. So what suits you better also suits me better. Mm. And I've always had the view that, experimentation brings us back to the very beginning of the talk, which is what's utterly bizarre about this is how little A/B experimentation has been done in this area. Because the benefits of video, of greater use of person-to-person video, I mean, fuck's sake, when I grew up in the 1970s, late 60s, early 70s, watching Star Trek, okay, and the two things we were all gagging for was video calls and flying cars. And what I never predicted is we'd get the video calls and not use it. So imagine if we invented flying cars. What's your flying car like, Ian? Oh, I never really bother flying it. No, I just drive on the roads. What? Right? Yep. And yet we had this thing, and admittedly it was a bit crap for the first 5 years. And a lot of people, I think, were poisoned by the initial experience. But even so, this is crazy. I mean, this is, whatever the ratio is, it isn't 99-1. Hmm. And so, no, I mean, in terms of home stuff, obviously, when the thing goes away, what we will do is redesign an office. So the people who like to partition work from home, we will probably experiment with property outside London. Partly, of course, for client away days and things, having a seaside office, which could cost you very, very little, okay, would be a nice thing. But that's also a place where people can go as an alternative space. If they want to be a bit sociable, but not go into the whole big office, or people who have trouble using public transport, you might be able to commute out on an empty train rather than commuting in on a full one. The other reason for that is that our requirement that people travel 5 days a week to central London effectively means that a third of what we pay them gets swallowed up by their landlord. And I don't see the point of that. We're paying twice. We're paying once for the real estate and then all over again in terms of the salaries we have to match. Just to give an example as a thought experiment, I met a guy who had been very, very well paid at Barclays, to the point of being like one of the top 5 people there. So he was being paid a few million quid a year, I would guess, reasonably, okay? And he then left his job and spent time as this is just a technical term, a twat. And twat stands for Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So he lived in France Friday to Monday, and then Monday evening, or maybe Tuesday morning, he'd fly into London, spend 3 days in London doing all the work that had to be done face to face, and then he'd welly it back to France and do all the work virtually for 4 days in some place in, the countryside. And eventually, another huge bank comes to inviting him back, as you'd expect to happen. And he sat down and he said, "How much would you have to pay me to give up the freedom to be in France on Monday and Friday?" He's still working on at least one of those days, but he's just working in France, okay? Then he sat down and he thought about it, and he chatted about it a bit with his wife, I think, and he said, there is no amount of money that makes that worthwhile, because the difference in extra, wodge of money will make to my lifestyle, okay, so I could, potentially I could buy a yacht, but the increased utility and happiness created by the yacht would be vastly less than the utility and happiness lost by being required to pay London property prices and spend, well, typically, 7 days of the week there.
Makes sense.
Makes sense, doesn't it? Yeah. So one of the things I think will be interesting is, and fortunately companies like Zoom have been newly enriched, is one of the things I think we actually have to do is those companies which are beneficiaries need to put advertising money into promoting the new normal. I mean, I feel a bit of a con artist, because you'll know this, because if you worked in advertising in the 1990s and early 2000s, half your agencies, if you had an IT client, half your agency's work consisted of showing someone with a laptop sitting by a lake, right? Because, you know, the entire laptop.
Or swimming pool.
Or swimming pool, exactly.
Resort swimming pool, yeah.
And so IT was selling this dream through Ogilvy and everybody else, while the workplace was entirely failing to deliver on it.
Mm.
And one of the things, okay, here's an interesting one. Outside's quite nice now. It's the beginning of the day. It's very sunny. I suddenly realized when you sign up for a 5-day week in an office, you're signing away 5/7 of your sunshine and fresh air. Okay? Now, what I will do when this is over is I will go out in the garden, put a table on, turn on my Wi-Fi extender, and do the rest of the day's work outside. If you've done that, if you've worked on a sunny day in a garden, it basically feels like being on holiday. You know,
Wow.
and to some extent, it is like being on holiday in the sense that you're getting a bit of vitamin D and you're getting a bit of fresh air and a bit of sunshine. You know, I'm not the guy who's going to take up kiteboarding, okay? So sitting in the sunshine and the fresh air is pretty much what I do when I'm on holiday.
Mm.
So the stock photo has finally become a reality.
The stock photo is finally becoming a reality. Exactly, yeah.
Congratulations, Rory. I love that.
But I mean, one of the interesting. I've got the house I've got is interesting, which is I live in the roof of a Robert Adam 18th century house, which was informed by behavioural science, which is the cheapest way to buy art is to buy architecture, because fantastic architecture doesn't impose a price premium on the property because it's all about location. And the second thing I discovered is that nobody moves out of the city to live in an apartment. So if you do move out of the city and find a really great apartment outside the city, it will be ridiculously cheap. Because everybody moves out of the city. Australians are even more guilty of this than everybody, aren't you? Because you're obsessed with your patch of land,
Yeah.
which is why I suppose Sydney is so huge, isn't it? I mean, geographically, Sydney is enormous.
Yeah.
I think the similar one is, do you know, I think the biggest city in America is St. Petersburg, Florida. Would you believe it? Because it's based on this principle of everybody having a detached house. And but the interesting thing there is that if you do move out and you find a really great apartment, nobody's looking for that. And so it was literally a case of kind of, you know, gaming the system.
Mm.
Cool.
Yeah. Wow. Fair enough.
I got one final question, Rory.
Of course.
I have aggressively suggested to a bunch of friends they need to watch one of your videos when I first found it. I think it was the one with the wine list story in it. And among them, there is a core demographic of women in the senior executive kind of area of life who go, the videos are really interesting, but also we find Rory kind of hot.
This is entirely news to me.
With his sort of kind of like Harry Styles' dad, you know, with the wavy hair and the dandyish dress sense and the brain and whatever. Do you get much of that?
Weirdly, not in Britain at all. I weirdly get a little bit of that overseas. There's a weird thing which is with an older demographic of American females. I always tease my wife, which she doesn't find remotely funny, which is that by the time I get to my 60s, I'm going to retire from advertising and spend my life as a gigolo working the cruise ship circuit out of Miami Beach. And my wife doesn't find that funny. But there is a kind of weird thing going on there, which, I mean, it's partly a fame thing. And it's a very weird thing because doing those TED Talks is kind of fascinating in the sense that it's micro fame, and it's very weird because 95% of people have no clue who you are as you wander around. And a great thing that famous people have always said is you never realize the value of anonymity until you lose it, you know, because it's irreversible pretty much. I mean, unless you have major plastic surgery or something. The loss of anonymity is irreversible, and suddenly you spend all your life wanting to be famous and realizing then that you can't escape it. And what's quite nice about microfame is that, you know, I'm not bothered by, you know, as I said, you know, I don't get screaming Japanese schoolgirls overturning my tour bus or anything like that, right? But when I'm walking through a Singapore shopping mall with my kids and someone comes up and goes, "Are you Rory Sutherland?" It's kind of cool for your kids that happens. It's about the only thing they respect me for, to be absolutely honest. So that microfame, which I suppose, what we will see, I think, increasingly is kind of microfame, niche fame. You know, when I look at these sort of motorhome videos, you know, and I spend 5 hours watching guys sell me American motorhomes that I could never drive on British roads for whatever reason. I'll tell you what fascinates me about it, and I think lots of people watching this will love it. What's lovely when you watch motorhome and also tiny home videos, okay? I'm a huge fan of the tiny home movement, because certainly for a second home, you don't require anything big. One of the interesting things about the whole video calling thing is, obviously on a video call, you have really rich people and people who are pretty skint. But actually, the rich people and the skint people are both sitting in one room. And, you know, there's a limit to how much you can make one room better than another room. But the one thing I love about the tiny home and RV movement is the ingenuity put into the use of space. You know, where every square foot does kind of, apart from the kitchen and the toilets typically, every square foot kind of does double duty. So when you stop driving, you reverse the 2 seats at the front and they're part of a dining table configuration. If you want a good one, Aquaholic and Motorboat and Yachting, the American magazine. I've also spent a load of time watching super yacht videos and premium yacht videos for that same ingenuity, where, you know, if you think about it, the intelligence of naval architects and RV architects in terms of the use they make of space dwarfs domestic residential architects. True. In terms of the use of ingenuity. And I love that. I mean, the fascinating thing also with super yachts is, even if you gave me £1 billion, I think I'd have enough self-awareness not to buy a super yacht. Okay. You might rent one, but generally people say that buying them, I've known people who work in the field and they say it actually leads to spiraling misery to most people who do it. Because you buy the first boat, and the first boat's actually quite fun. And so you assume that a bigger boat is twice as much fun. And actually it almost works the other way around, because you now, the only harbours you can go into are boats where you're surrounded by boats even bigger than your own, and so forth. And it leads to this sort of spiraling sense of inadequacy. But the one thing I'd love to do with a super yacht is park the bloody thing. Okay? You know, just the idea of, they call it mooring, don't they, in yachty world, or docking, okay? But the business of manoeuvring one of those things into a narrow space would be a sheer joy. What I discovered in YouTube is there are loads of videos where they actually send up a drone, by the way. So the super yacht will send up a drone, so they've got live aerial footage of the yacht manoeuvring to help them do it. And wow. I've watched like hours of this. And what suddenly occurred to me is, actually, through watching this shit, I'm getting 90% of the value of owning a super yacht at about, well, literally 0.00001% of the cost, which ain't bad. Because that would be the bit I'd enjoy the most. Mooring the thing would be a bloody joy, you know, going, okay, we've got the 2 bow thrusters in operation. That shit would be, I'd be like a pig in shit doing that. Actually sitting in the middle of nowhere with 5 Ukrainian prostitutes on the foredeck, you know, you can take it or leave it. But the maneuvering shit will be brilliant, you know. I mean, I do that. I basically just spend my whole time docking it and then moving out again. And so the ability to enjoy things virtually, as I said in the Spectator article, look, it's actually a mark of high intelligence. The only animals, someone wrote in to me and said that their mum in South Africa had a dick that watched television, which is kind of antelope. But as far as I know, only humans and dolphins can watch TV without requiring any training. Chimps, they don't get the idea at all. They don't get the idea this is a representation of reality. They get confused and they go and look around the back or smash the television or whatever. You can train them to do it, but it takes time. Humans and dolphins get it immediately. Dolphins, cool, that's interesting. What's he doing with that fish? Okay. And this is a unique human gift and a mark of superior intelligence, to be able to enjoy things virtually. And instead, we disparage people with terms like couch potato. But, I mean, we're going to have to ask this question in 10 years' time, okay? What the hell do we do about over-tourism? Because, you know, we've had a huge debate about immigration, but actually there's a debate about tourism, which we need to have. Because what happens, okay, is if you suddenly have 1 billion people who can all afford to travel long haul, there's a problem, because short haul travel is quite nuanced, because you go back several times. And you know, if I went to Italy, okay, I wouldn't go and see the Leaning Tower of Pisa and the Vatican. I'd go and discover an interesting medium-sized Italian town and hang out there. So short haul travel, repeat travel, can be quite nuanced and interesting. You know, I go to America a lot. I've been to the Wisconsin State Fair. I've been to, really obscure national monuments, that kind of thing. But let's be honest, okay, there are cities in China with a population of 12 million people, and I've never heard of them, okay? Let's imagine I only went to China for a week and I thought it was the only time I was going to go there in my entire life. What would I have to see? Great Wall of China. Well, admittedly, that's quite big. It's like the Grand Canyon, so you don't get a massive crowding problem. But there's a bit of it closest to Beijing, which gets 90% of the crowds. A panda, right? This is a total moron's eye view of China, really, okay? The Terracotta Army, the Forbidden Palace, in the middle of the thing, maybe the Wuhan wet fish market, if I was feeling adventurous, which is now the 8th most famous place in China. And you might see the Three Gorges, something or other, although apparently that's largely industrial, so it's not worth seeing. I don't know, okay? Now, the problem is, what happens when that happens in both directions? So you have, everybody who goes to South America goes to bloody Machu Picchu, Iguazu Falls, Copacabana Beach. When you've only heard of 5 places and everybody wants to tick them off their bucket list, Bondi Beach must suffer from this in Sydney, mustn't it? Yep. I mean, the weird thing about Bondi, there's nothing really that special about Bondi Beach, is there? It's just that we've heard of it. Is that fair?
It's a really good surf. It's a really good. It's an underrated surf beach, but yeah, okay. It's very crowded.
So the interesting thing is, I probably could name another Sydney beach if you put a gun to my head or something, or give me a truth drug. But this problem of the total exponential fame problem, which is that there are the 5 most famous places on a continent are more famous than the next 20 places combined. The problem isn't the volume of tourism, it's its concentration. So the reason I've ended on this subject is that one of the great things about this virus is it's given people a crash course in amateur virology, which isn't much use because, me learning about virology isn't that valuable. But having millions of people think in terms of complex systems with feedback loops and exponential effects and butterfly effects and so on, having people having a crash course in complexity thinking may be really valuable. Because what we tend to do in business is we tend to understand the world by pretending everything in the world is kind of linear and Newtonian, developing a model for that pretense, and then solving for the model. And a bad model is sometimes worse than no model at all. We'd be better off just admitting we were confused and testing things more in some cases. But the very fact that everybody's had a crash course in virology, in advertising, I often noticed that people who'd studied biology or genetics or something like that, or evolutionary science, made very good account planners. And I suddenly realized that, of course, if you've gone to university to do genetics or biology, you understand complex systems because that's what you're focusing on. Whereas economists spend all their time focusing on pretend simple systems. And so the crash course in complexity thing, it was very interesting. There's an article in The Spectator by Matt Ridley where he kind of diagnoses what we know and what we don't know about the pandemic. And Matt's an evolutionary scientist, effectively. And it's very interesting because when you read it, you go, I'm reading the work of someone who thinks this way. And so my end thing is a bit weird. I think you should teach evolution and Darwinism in school, not because it's true. I mean, I think it is true, by the way. I'm not saying it isn't. But whether it's true or not doesn't matter, actually. Whether evolution is true doesn't matter to whether you teach it or not. Because what matters is by teaching it, you give people a different way to think and a different way of approaching problems. So one of the best people in Australia, I've mentioned Nick Gruen, I've mentioned Steve Keen. There's a guy called Jason Collins, who I think is based in Perth, who has a blog. He's one of the best evolutionary thinkers I've ever come across. He's going to be at Nudgestop on June the 12th. And what we're doing is our original behavioral science conference, which was going to be by the sea in Kent, is going virtual, and it's going global. It's going to start in Sydney and work its way west with the daylight through Perth, probably Singapore, maybe a bit of Hong Kong. We'll probably stop off maybe in Cape Town, Paris, London, East Coast, West Coast, actually Albuquerque, West Coast, Hawaii. And so we're going to have 12 hours of constant behavioural science, which will be streamed, I think, to LinkedIn Live and also streamed to YouTube if you've got a smart TV. It's June the 12th. If you go to nudgestock.co.uk. And I'm pretty sure that Jason's going to be speaking there.
Cool.
And I often end up coming to Australia on a plane and going, I don't know why you've flown me all the way out here. You could have asked Jason to do this. But it's a bit like Jesus, isn't it? No man's a prophet in his hometown. The amount to which you draw an audience depends on the distance to which you've travelled. And so, one of the things I'm going to end on is that point that, the reason I started by saying that the foundation of psychology has to be evolutionary psychology, because it's the only theory with really good explanatory power on which you can base anything. And as one guy said, nothing in life makes sense except in the light of evolution. But I'm going to end the talk by talking about something, which is complementary to that, which is, even if evolution isn't true at all, okay, teaching it is really, really valuable, because it teaches people to think in a fundamentally different way. And markets are highly complex systems. Individual behavior is highly complex. Collective behavior is massively complex. Just as I said, effectively, video conferencing, an economist would say the reason people aren't using it is because they've discovered it's crap and they don't want it. Therefore, no further intervention is required, because you can't make it any cheaper because it's practically free, right? Yeah. And a complexity theorist would say, no, maybe we've just got stuck in a social equilibrium, which is very difficult to break. And actually, if we got 25% of people over the line, it's a bit like virology. If we just got 25% of people over the line with flexible working, we'd actually start to form a completely new equilibrium where essentially what started as an oddity becomes a norm. And the same applies to something like solar panels. If we could just get one house in 4, 80% of the obstacle to adoption goes away. Electric cars, so on and so forth. So just to give an example, let's imagine Ogilvy has a board meeting in New York, and there's one very senior guy who's awkward. And he says, I can't go to your meeting, but I want to attend it virtually in the evening in Europe, because it's important that I see what you're talking about, but I can't travel out because X, right? Now Ogilvy is obliged for the first time to put a webcam or a meeting owl in their board meeting, right? Or 2 owls. You can actually have 2 of them. They're going to develop interoperability between them. So I did say I was a bit of an evangelist, okay? What happens then? I think what happens then is 5 other people learning there's a video alternative will go and say, actually, to be honest, my budget's a bit squeezed at the moment. I could do without the flights. I'm going to attend virtually as well. And what you'll probably end up with under the new equilibrium might be 50-50. But at the moment, the equilibrium is attend the meeting in person and you're a worthy and committed member of our team. Or alternative is you don't attend the meeting and suffer from massive FOMO.
Makes sense.
And so if literally only 1 million people come away from this with a better understanding of how to think in complexity terms, then there'll be quite big benefits. If we're lucky, it'll be more than that.